The novel Dr. Zhivago makes us enormously aware of the hugeness of what at that time was the Soviet Union, and of course what traditionally had been the Russian Empire. If you just think of one simple geographical fact, that you could take 3 United Stateses, and if you put it within the boundaries of the old Russian Empire and the Soviet Union in Pasternak's time, it would fit. In short, the area of Russia was something like 3 times the area of our country, and as you know, our country is not exactly a small country. The enormousness of Russian nature, the enormousness of the physical area of this country is something that you deeply feel in this novel, and of course it's something that enters into the makeup of almost every Russian who's aware of the country in which he lives, of the culture in which he lives. There's a breadth, there's a depth, which is physical as well as spiritual, and the spiritual kind of reflects the physical. Dr. Zhivago makes us look at some of the major historical and political events in early 20th century in the USSR through the deeply introspective eyes of the title character, who's both a medical doctor and a major poet. The whole emphasis on the novel is on an individual who finds many ways to separate himself from the society around him. It would be fair to call the work a plea for the individual character in a world that was rushing toward an idea of collectivism. And yet, at the same time, the novel does manage to give us a powerful poetic impression of the dramatic events that happened around that individual, and of course, in the enormous breadth of that country. You feel this particularly strongly in the opening of the novel, where you have a whirling snowstorm, which of course often happens in a Russian winter, or at least did happen before the days of global warming. And as a young boy, Yuri Zhivago witnesses the burial of his mother. Imagine the coffin, the old-fashioned Eastern Orthodox Christian coffin, brought out into that driving, blinding blizzard that the boy and of course the mourners of the family have to go through to watch that coffin of his dear mother slowly lowered into the ground and of course covered up by the snow that's coming, constantly coming from this blizzard, which goes on for well over 24 hours. In the imagination of the young boy, as he thinks about it, it seems that the snowstorm would both bury the cabbage patch and his mother helplessly, ever more deeply into the ground. It's as if his mother is going ever more deeply into the reality, which was Russia, and he, as a boy, as a mourner, is seeing it through the tremendous whirling, the tremendous energy, the tremendous natural energy of this snowstorm. It's a powerful image and a powerful beginning of the book. Now, what we're going to see is Zhivago gradually going away from these forces which unite him and his family with Russia. He's going to be living in a kind of isolation, that is, an increasing isolation, from a Russia which both natural forces and human events are driving away from him, and his deeply poetic sensibility, which remembers the now disappeared wealth of the Zhivago family as a kind of a golden dream. Here he is coming from this family which had a marvelous life. Evidently the father had once upon a time both inherited and been involved in business operations that gave magical places to live, magical events remembered through the memory of a child at that time. The first part of the novel shows the events leading up to World War I and the 2 revolutions of 1917. We see the large amount of confused political and religious thought coursing through the last decades of Tsarist rule. And of course, not only was it confused thought, but it was also tremendously creative. First of all, there were the Tolstoyans. As you know, Pasternak's family was very much connected with Tolstoy, and there had been a kind of a cult of Tolstoy's later ideas among people who called themselves Tolstoyans. Gorky had once described them in the memoirs that we talked about. Gorky described the Tolstoyans as a huge bunch of yelping dogs around a single figure in the middle, Tolstoy, who tolled like a bell. And every time he tolled like a bell, the dogs tried to yap to see if they couldn't get into the tune of the bell. But of course, they could never get into the bell's tune. They could only do it in their own way. In short, Pasternak and many others as well saw the Tolstoyans as a kind of a pale reflection and a rather distorted reflection of the great originality of Tolstoy. This is most clearly and succinctly shown by the fat man dressed in a gray Tolstoyan shirt, the famous Tolstoyan shirt which came well down to the knees from the shoulders, who propounds the ideas of the master writer. Zhivago, and perhaps here Pasternak himself is talking, remarks on how the ideas of the genius who had never known peace enjoyed a long, unchanging rest in the mind of the Tolstoyan, becoming hopelessly shallow in the process. Tolstoy, who could never rest contented with one idea, who was always pounding, always trying to go forward from one idea to another, hoping somehow that he could find that central idea, but never finding it. And in the process, of course, intriguing us with the breadth and the depth of his mind, is interpreted by these people as a rather shallow, unchanging reality that they try to follow. Then, of course, you have the traditional Eastern Orthodox religious thought represented by the uncle of Yuri Zhivago, Nikolai Nikolaevich, who was somehow trying to find through the Christian religion an ideology which is appropriate to his day, which includes the tremendous revolutionary events, who's trying to work out some attitude, some relation toward death, which will admit the possibility of resurrection, will admit the possibility that death is not simply the end of human life, but that human life goes on in memory, human life goes on in creativity, human life goes on in spirituality, long beyond the physical existence of an individual on this earth. Of course, the great strength of the Christian religion as they understood it. Then, of course, there are the revolutionaries who demand that people think exactly the way they do, that people agree that society will be built in a way absolutely reflecting the ideology as set down by people like Marx and Engels and Lenin and others like that. Now, we understand that Zhivago will never be at home among people who spout unceasingly and unreflectively an ideology which never changes, in phrases which become hopeless cliches. We see that wherever his sensibility turns, it sees new things. It understands things in a new way. It interprets things in a new way. If he's dealing with Pushkin, you get a very original impression of Pushkin, a Pushkin who isn't anyone else's Pushkin. If he deals with medicine, you see that medicine has to be practiced in a particular way, the way he understands it, the way he wants to do it. If it comes to family relations will have to be carried out in the way that he sees it, in a way that makes him comfortable. In short, this is not a man that any group, that any outside force, that any utter arrangement of life can possibly control, but rather the force of life itself, which is constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly flowing. That's, of course, the Zhivago. We also see the confused and sometimes violent family relations that went on among the major characters in the book. Our attention focuses most strongly on Lara Guichard, daughter of a Belgian hatmaker. As a young doctor, Zhivago cannot help but notice her special sensitivity and intelligence. In a way, she reminds us of Pushkin's Tatyana Larina from Eugene Onegin. As Onegin looks at her and realizes her possibilities, realizes her sensitivity without being able to react to it, without being able to get close to it. Lara's fate becomes mixed up with a character named Komarovsky, an older man, a man of some power in pre-revolutionary Russia, as well as in the events immediately after the revolution. Komarovsky is attracted to Lara even when she's in high school, and turns into a rather sadistic lover to whom she responds, but not always with a great deal of pleasure. Now, it was the same Komarovsky who had also been with Zhivago's father when the father had committed suicide on a train ride. So, of course, Komarovsky relates to Yuri Zhivago both through Lara and through his association with Zhivago's father. The affairs between Komarovsky and Lara become so mixed up that eventually she decides that she will try to shoot him. At a Christmas party, she actually pulls out a pistol which has been given to her and tries to shoot him. As a matter of fact, she doesn't hit Komarovsky, she hits another man who's a political figure, wounding him slightly, thereby getting her and, of course, the whole family into a great deal of trouble. So that the relations between Lara and Komarovsky and Lara and Zhivago become very, very complicated and very tangled. This becomes even more so during World War I, when Zhivago, as a young doctor, is posted near the front in a military hospital, and by a certain coincidence suddenly runs into Lara, who has become a nurse in that hospital. He finds himself attracted to her in spite of the fact that by this time he's become a married man, and of course any kind of real attraction to her would mean disloyalty to his wife. Laura resists it, but you understand that between them there is growing a very strong relationship. A relationship which, by the way, reflects one in real life between Pasternak and his famous mistress, Olga Ivinskaya. Eventually, Zhivago comes back from this military experience to revolutionary Moscow. That is, it's during the time of World War I. At the end of World War I, as you already know, the Russian government is changing, and of course he comes back to a Moscow which has become very, very changed. As a matter of fact, on the train ride back, he runs into a hunter who gives him a duck. He doesn't realize just how valuable this duck is until he gets to Moscow, which he finds is starving with a terrible lack of food and fuel and all of the terrible things that were going on at that time. We're now going to be seeing the events of the revolution not through the eyes of Sholokov's Cossacks, who were far from the center of what was happening, far from the center of ideology, but rather through the intellectuals who understand very well just what's happening. Zhivago gets back to Moscow. He shares this duck with his family. His family by this time has been put in before the revolution they had lived in a rather large house, a rather large comfortable house. Now the revolutionaries are forcing them, as the former owners, to live on one floor of the house at the very top of the house. They're in very straitened circumstances, and of course the appearance of Zhivago with this hunter's duck is something that's a real luxury for them. In the course of the banquet, Zhivago makes a long speech, partly under the influence of alcohol that they have there, about what the revolution will bring. The revolution will bring a sea of blood which will engulf everybody. He says, in these 5 or 10 years, we Russians will have experienced more than any other people do in a century. But at the same time, he finds himself, in a curious way, somewhat enthusiastic toward this very ocean of blood. He proceeds to serve enthusiastically in the socialist medical services. He's convinced, at least for a time, that society can become better, that perhaps they do have to go through these terrible convulsions, but at the end of these convulsions, something better will come of it. Of course, his intellectual friends consider his convictions impossibly red in the sense of being leftist, but he sticks to his guns. But while he continues his medical work, things in Moscow go from bad to worse, with shortages of all necessary food and supplies, general malnutrition, rampaging sickness, especially during the terrible winter months, and finally it's clear that there's nothing to keep them in Moscow. The family simply can't stay there. They're living in circumstances that no family can live in. They decide to leave for a former estate of his wife's family, thousands of miles to the east in Siberia. And here we get what's perhaps the most impressive part of the novel. Pasternak describes, or has us vicariously experience, a train trip in the middle of the winter, or rather toward the end of winter, from Moscow all the way through the eastern part of Russia, deeply into Siberia. Pasternak manages to get across the huge expanse of the country, whitened and seemingly stretched by the endless snows of the Russian winter. You remember that snowstorm at the very beginning of the novel, which seems to bury his mother deeper and deeper. Now this snowstorm seems to be burying all of Russia at a time of terrible change. He also manages to communicate the terrible tensions of the time, both political and military, with sudden imprisonment or even death waiting at any given moment. In the very beginning, we experienced the freight car in which they travel. Of course, he had hoped, naturally, to travel in a car that would have seats, but there was no such car available. That was available only for the soldiers who were being taken east in the train. When Tonya, his wife, gets into the train, she says, it feels like a pigsty on wheels. It feels like it's going to fall apart at any moment. It doesn't happen that way, but of course, the experience of traveling in a freight car in the middle of the winter is really something. There's also an incident where, together with the people who are traveling away from Moscow, not only are revolutionary soldiers travel, but a whole bunch of prisoners, people who've been taken prisoners by the Soviet power, are traveling in this car. A young man has been put into the car by mistake. He was there to stay while one of the prisoners would go and then come back, but since the prisoner didn't come back, this young man had to stay, and we see this young man taken entirely accidentally by a terrible bureaucratic mistake in this train all the way to Siberia. You begin to get a sense of what terrible disruptions are happening in family life in Russia at that time.